Have you ever felt that shift in someone's energy, like they were studying you instead of loving you, like they were calculating how much effort you would tolerate before you finally cracked? This is the part nobody talks about. When an avoidant believes you're easy to play, it's not because you're weak, it's because you're warm. It's because you show up. It's because you lead with understanding instead of ego. And in their world, that combination can look like someone who will stay no matter what. They thought you would chase. They thought you would overthink yourself into submission. They thought you would beg for clarity while they gave you confusion. But what they didn't realize is that your silence would eventually become louder than all their games. In the beginning, it didn't look like manipulation, it looked like charm. It looked like independence. It looked like someone who just needs space or isn't great at texting. And because you're emotionally intelligent, you gave them the benefit of the doubt. You told yourself they just move differently. You told yourself not everyone expresses affection the same way. You tried to adapt. You tried to be patient. You tried to meet them halfway even when they were standing 10 steps back. They felt that. They saw your effort. And instead of appreciating it, they started measuring it. How long before you double text? How long before you ask what's wrong? How long before you blame yourself for their distance? They weren't confused about you. They were observing how much you'd endure. And here's the part that hurts. Your kindness looked like weakness to someone who survives by emotional detachment. You weren't dramatic. You weren't demanding. You didn't create chaos to feel connected. You simply showed up consistently. But to an avoidant who's used to people reacting loudly to their distance, your calmness felt like leverage. They thought, this one won't leave. This one will wait. This one cares more. And in their internal rulebook, the person who cares more is the one with less power. So they leaned back even further. They tested the waters. They delayed replies just a little longer. They went quiet just to see if you'd panic. They sprinkled affection just enough to keep you attached. Not because they hated you, but because control feels safer than vulnerability. When they pulled away for the first time, you probably felt it in your chest, that subtle coldness, that slight shift in tone, the way conversations started feeling shorter. You questioned yourself before you questioned them. Did I say too much? Did I expect too much? Should I give them more space? And that right there is what they anticipated. They expected you to internalize their inconsistency. They expected you to chase reassurance from someone who was creating the insecurity. Because in their past, that's what usually happens. When they distance themselves, people run toward them. When they withdraw affection, people increase effort. It confirms their belief that they hold the upper hand. And for a while, maybe you did run toward them. Maybe you did try harder. Maybe you did try to prove you weren't too much. But something inside you started waking up. It was subtle at first, a quiet exhaustion, a realization that love shouldn't feel like you're constantly auditioning. You noticed that you were the one initiating most of the emotional conversations. You noticed that your reassurance was flowing one way. You noticed that you were shrinking parts of yourself just to maintain their comfort. And that awareness began to shift your energy. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped asking for crumbs to turn into meals. You started observing instead of reacting. And that's when the dynamic began to change. They thought you were easy to play because you were expressive, because you cared openly, because you didn't hide your feelings behind pride, but they didn't account for your self-respect. They didn't account for the moment you would quietly decide that consistency matters more than chemistry. When you stopped chasing their distance, it confused them. When you matched their energy instead of compensating for it, it unsettled them. They were used to being pursued when they withdrew. They weren't used to someone stepping back calmly and saying nothing at all. And here's what they never tell you about avoidant behavior. It's often a test of boundaries disguised as independence. When they go silent, it's not always because they're busy. Sometimes it's because they want to see if you'll break the silence first. When they act detached, it's not always because they feel nothing. Sometimes it's because they're trying to regulate their fear of closeness by creating space. But instead of communicating that fear, they create confusion. And they assume you'll tolerate it. They assume your love will override your limits. In those early stages, they likely believed they had emotional leverage. They probably told themselves you were more invested. Maybe they felt slightly powerful knowing you cared deeply. It's uncomfortable to admit, but for some avoidants, being the less emotionally expressive partner feels safer. It means they don't have to risk rejection first. It means they can control the pace. It means they can pull away whenever things feel too intense. And because you were open about your feelings, they assumed they held the advantage. But the thing about underestimating someone emotionally intelligent is this. Once they see the pattern, they adjust without drama. You didn't explode, you didn't beg, you didn't threaten to leave just to scare them. You simply began to detach in silence. You started pouring energy back into yourself. You started focusing on your own growth instead of trying to decode their mood shifts. And that quiet shift was something they didn't anticipate. They thought if you ever pulled away, it would be loud and emotional. They didn't expect calm distance. When you stopped reacting to their inconsistency, they felt it. The delayed texts didn't get a double follow-up. The vague responses didn't get interrogated. The cold days didn't get chased with warmth. You matched their rhythm. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. And that's when their confidence in the dynamic began to crack. Because if you're no longer chasing, then they're no longer in control. They misjudged your patience as dependency. They misread your empathy as insecurity. They assumed your loyalty meant you wouldn't walk away. But what they didn't understand is that emotionally secure strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't compete. It observes. It decides. And when it finally moves, it does so quietly. You see, they thought they were playing a game. They thought they were managing the emotional tempo. They thought they could keep you slightly off balance so you'd keep leaning toward them. But what they didn't realize is that you were never trying to win anything. You were trying to build something real. And once you realized they were more invested in control than connection, something inside you shifted permanently. There's a moment in every dynamic like this where the person being underestimated realizes their worth. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's an internal click, a calm understanding that love should not require self-abandonment, and once that understanding settles in, the energy changes. You no longer feel anxious waiting for their replies. You no longer feel compelled to fill every silence. You no longer feel responsible for maintaining the entire emotional foundation. And that's the moment they were wrong about you. They thought you were easy to play because you loved deeply. But loving deeply doesn't mean you lack boundaries. It means you give fully until you see it's not reciprocated. They thought you would tolerate hot and cold cycles indefinitely. They thought you would keep proving your value. They didn't realize that your strength was never in chasing them. It was in knowing when to stop. The first 5 chapters of the story aren't about revenge. They're about awakening. They're about recognizing that being understanding doesn't mean being used. They're about seeing how someone's fear of intimacy can turn into subtle power plays and how your quiet self-respect dismantles them. They thought you were easy. They thought you'd bend endlessly. But what they encountered instead was someone who could love without losing themselves. And that realization is only the beginning. And then something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly enough that only someone who was watching closely would notice. You stopped moving the way you used to. You stopped over-explaining your tone. You stopped filling the silence they created. You stopped asking for reassurance from someone who acted confused whenever you needed clarity. You started matching energy instead of trying to fix it. And that quiet change, it unsettled them more than any argument ever could. At first, they told themselves it was nothing. You were just busy. You were just tired. You were just having a week. But there was something different in your eyes. Something steadier. You weren't leaning in the same way. You weren't emotionally reaching across the distance they created. You were standing still. And when an avoidant person feels someone stop reaching, it does something to their nervous system. Because they are used to people chasing. They are used to emotional pursuit. They are used to being the one who pulls away and watches the other panic. But you didn't panic. You adjusted, and that adjustment triggered something deep inside them. Avoidants are wired to fear being engulfed. Too much closeness feels like suffocation. Too much emotional demand feels like pressure. So when they create space, it usually feels like relief. It feels safe. It feels controlled. But what they don't always admit, even to themselves, is that underneath that fear of closeness lives an equally powerful fear of abandonment, a fear of being left, a fear of not being chosen, a fear of being replaceable. When you stopped chasing, you didn't just create distance, you activated that fear. At night, when their phone didn't light up with your long messages trying to understand them, something felt off. When you didn't double text, when you didn't ask if everything was okay, when you didn't soften your tone to keep the peace. The silence felt different. It didn't feel like space they controlled anymore. It felt like space they didn't, or in that lack of control, that's what really unsettled them. You weren't angry, you weren't dramatic, you weren't posting cryptic messages, you weren't trying to make them jealous. You simply stopped accepting inconsistency. You stopped pretending confusion was depth. You stopped interpreting breadcrumbs as effort. You didn't announce your boundaries. You just lived them. That's when they realized you had standards. Before, they thought you would always be available, emotionally present, ready to work through whatever mood they were in. They assumed your empathy meant elasticity, that you would stretch endlessly to accommodate their distance. But empathy without boundaries feels like weakness to someone who has learned to equate emotional power with detachment. They misread your softness. They thought it meant you would never leave. But when you began responding instead of reacting, something flipped. The power dynamic shifted quietly. In the beginning, they believed they had the upper hand because they cared less, or at least appeared to. They were the one who could disappear for hours, the one who could delay replies, the one who could pull back affection without explanation. And in relationships shaped by insecurity, the one who seems less invested often feels more powerful. But when you emotionally detached, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, the balance changed. You stopped negotiating for consistency. You stopped trying to decode mixed signals. You started observing instead of absorbing. And when you did that, you removed the emotional leverage they thought they had. Avoidants are deeply uncomfortable when they are no longer in control of the emotional distance. They may not say it out loud, they may not show it in obvious ways, but watch closely. Suddenly, they are paying attention to details they used to ignore. They are noticing when you're online but not talking to them. They are noticing when your energy feels lighter. They are noticing when your replies are polite instead of warm. They are noticing the absence of pursuit, and that absence becomes loud. They start checking your activity, watching your stories, reading between your short responses, not because they suddenly became expressive, but because the shift in your energy feels like a threat. When you were chasing, they felt safe. Now that you're steady, they feel uncertain. And uncertainty is something they don't handle well. There's a quiet ego hit that happens when an avoidant realizes someone they assumed would always stay is capable of walking away, not loudly, not destructively, but calmly. And calm detachment can feel more destabilizing than emotional chaos, because chaos is predictable. Calm withdrawal is not. They begin to question things they once took for granted. Why aren't you reacting the same way? Why aren't you asking for reassurance? Why aren't you trying to fix this? Why does it feel like you're okay without them? That last question is the one that lingers. Because the story they told themselves was that you needed them more than they needed you, that you were more emotionally invested, that you would bend before they ever had to confront their own walls. But when you stood firm, not in anger, but in self-respect, it disrupted the narrative they were comfortable with. And here's the part most people don't understand about avoidance. Their emotional processing is often delayed. While you were feeling everything in real time, the confusion, the inconsistency, the emotional whiplash, they were suppressing, compartmentalizing, minimizing, telling themselves it wasn't that deep. But once you stepped back, once the threat of losing you became real, their emotions started surfacing. In the quiet moments, in the stillness after work, in the late hours when distractions fade, that's when your absence starts to echo. That's when memories feel sharper. That's when your consistency feels rare instead of expected. And suddenly they're replaying things. The way you tried to understand them without judgment, the way you gave space without punishment, the way you didn't demand perfection, just effort. They remember the conversations where you offered reassurance instead of accusation. They remember how safe it felt to talk to you before their fear kicked in. They remember the warmth they once pulled away from. And that's when it starts to sink in. You weren't easy to play. You were safe. And safety is unfamiliar territory for someone wired to equate love with unpredictability. Your silence didn't just create distance, it created psychological space. Space where they could no longer distract themselves from their own feelings. Space where your absence forced introspection. And introspection is uncomfortable for someone who survives by avoiding, but in that discomfort, clarity begins forming. They start noticing how calm you were compared to others, how you didn't create drama to feel connected, how you didn't try to control them, how you didn't use jealousy as leverage. You offered something steady, and steady can feel boring to someone used to chaos until it's gone. Then it feels rare. Then it feels irreplaceable. And the irony is heavy, because the very thing they once pulled away from, your consistency, becomes the thing they quietly crave. But by now, you've changed. Not in bitterness, not in resentment, but in awareness. You see patterns more clearly. You feel your own worth more solidly. You understand that loving someone deeply does not require you to abandon yourself. And that realization, that's what makes the difference. Because the moment you stopped trying to convince someone of your value, you became undeniable. They thought you were easy to play because you were kind, because you were patient, because you were emotionally available. But they didn't account for your self-respect. They didn't anticipate your limit. They didn't realize that your love had boundaries. And when those boundaries quietly activated, everything shifted. Now they're the one sitting with questions. Now they're the one feeling the distance. Now they're the one wondering if they miscalculated. And deep down, whether they admit it or not, they know they did. You weren't easy to play. You were just loving without games. And when you finally stopped playing a game you never agreed to, the illusion of control they once held slipped through their hands. And when the illusion of control slipped through their hands, something happened that they never prepared for. Their ego took a hit they couldn't immediately rationalize. Avoidants often survive emotionally by convincing themselves they don't need anyone too deeply. It's a protective story. If they don't need you, they can't be hurt by you. If they care less, they can't lose more. So when you stopped reacting to their distance, when you stopped proving your devotion through over-effort, it quietly challenged that story. Because suddenly the one who was more invested wasn't acting invested anymore. And that's destabilizing. They may not show it outwardly. They may still act calm, detached, unbothered. But internally, there's friction. Because the identity they built, the one who holds emotional power by staying slightly out of reach, starts to crack when someone they underestimated no longer reaches. It's not just about you pulling away. It's about what your withdrawal represents. It represents choice. It represents standards. It represents the possibility that they are not as irreplaceable as they assumed. That's where the ego feels it most. They underestimated your self-respect. They thought your empathy meant you would endlessly excuse their inconsistency. They thought your understanding nature meant you would rationalize every moment of emotional unavailability. They didn't realize that empathy and self-abandonment are not the same thing. You can understand someone's wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them. You can recognize someone's fear of intimacy without sacrificing your need for consistency. You can love someone deeply and still decide that love without effort isn't enough. And once you embodied that truth, something inside them shifted from confidence to curiosity, and from curiosity to concern. Because now they have to confront something uncomfortable. Maybe you weren't the fragile one in this dynamic. Maybe they were. Avoidants are used to people chasing them because most people react emotionally to distance. When someone pulls away, the anxious partner leans in. The more distant they become, the more the other person pursues. It reinforces the avoidant's belief that they are in control, that they are desired, that they are needed. But when you didn't lean in, when you didn't panic, you disrupted that familiar pattern. And disrupting a pattern forces reflection. They start replaying moments in their head. The times you tried to communicate calmly, the times you expressed your needs without accusation, the times you offered reassurance instead of control. They remember how safe it felt to talk to you before their defenses kicked in. They remember how patient you were when they withdrew. They remember how you never tried to cage them. You just asked for clarity. And here's where it gets complicated for them. They realize you were the safe one. Not safe in a boring way, safe in a regulated way, safe in a way that didn't threaten their independence. You weren't trying to control their schedule. You weren't demanding constant validation. You weren't trying to merge identities. You were offering partnership. But to someone wired for distance, safety can feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliar can feel threatening. Chaos feels normal to someone who grew up equating love with unpredictability. Intensity feels familiar. Push-pull dynamics feel like chemistry. But steadiness, consistency, calm emotional presence, that can feel foreign, almost suspicious. And sometimes instead of leaning into safety, they sabotage it. Because if something feels too stable, it means they might have to lower their guard. It means they might have to risk being known. It means they might have to admit they care. So they created distance. But once you stopped filling that distance with effort, the silence became loud. There's something about silence that forces truth to surface. When you were constantly engaging, constantly explaining, constantly trying to connect, they didn't have to sit with their own feelings. Your presence buffered them from introspection. Your effort masked their avoidance. But when you stepped back, the distractions faded. And in that quiet space, they started feeling things they had pushed down. They feel the absence of your reassurance. They feel the lack of your warmth. They feel the missing consistency. They may not articulate it as longing. They may frame it as curiosity, as boredom, as wondering what you're doing. But underneath it all is a simple truth. Your absence feels different than they expected. They thought you would fight harder. They thought you would protest louder. They thought you would beg for clarity. Instead, you accepted what was shown to you and adjusted. And that adjustment is what broke the pattern. You didn't try to win them over. You didn't try to prove your value. You didn't try to outmaneuver their distance. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that required you to shrink. And that kind of strength doesn't scream. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't manipulate. It stands still. Avoidants often don't process loss in real time. While you were feeling the weight of their inconsistency immediately, they were compartmentalizing, distracting, minimizing, telling themselves it wasn't serious. But once the reality of losing access to you becomes tangible, their emotional processing begins. And it doesn't look dramatic. It looks like late night thoughts. It looks like scrolling through old messages. It looks like rereading conversations where you showed up fully. It looks like comparing your steadiness to the unpredictability of others. And slowly, almost unwillingly, appreciation starts forming where indifference once lived. They realize that not everyone communicates calmly. Not everyone offers space without punishment. Not everyone loves without trying to control. You did, and they mistook it for something disposable. That's the weight of it. They assumed you were replaceable because you were accessible. They assumed you would always be there because you always showed up. They didn't realize that accessibility is a gift, not a guarantee. Now, as your energy becomes less available, they begin to understand the difference between someone who is easy to reach and someone who is easy to lose. You weren't easy to play. You were easy to love, and that scared them. Because loving someone easy to love requires vulnerability. It requires reciprocity. It requires stepping out from behind emotional walls. And vulnerability is the very thing they built their defenses against. But here's what makes this story powerful. You didn't harden. You didn't turn cold. You didn't become someone unrecognizable. You simply became someone who chooses themselves. You still care, you still feel, you still love deeply, but you no longer chase someone who withholds effort. You no longer interpret inconsistency as mystery. You no longer romanticize emotional unavailability as depth. And that shift, it forces them to confront something they've avoided for a long time. The possibility that their distance cost them something real. The possibility that their need for control pushed away someone who offered safety. The possibility that they misjudged the strongest person in the room. Because strength isn't always loud. Sometimes strength is loving fully and walking away when that love isn't honored. They thought you were easy to play because you didn't fight dirty, because you didn't manipulate, because you didn't mirror their detachment. But what they didn't understand is that the calmest person in the room is often the most powerful. And by the time they begin to realize your value, you're no longer trying to convince them of it. You're simply living it. And now we arrive at the part they never prepared for. The part where the silence doesn't just echo, it teaches. When you stopped filling the space, when you stopped cushioning their avoidance with your consistency, they were left alone with themselves. No emotional buffer, no reassurance to lean on, no one decoding their moods for them, just stillness. And for someone who survives by staying distracted from their own depth, stillness can feel overwhelming. The silence became loud. Not because you were posting indirect messages, not because you were trying to provoke them, but because your absence removed the comfort of being chosen without effort. You were no longer validating their distance by chasing it. You were no longer proving your devotion through overextension. And in that quiet, they began hearing thoughts they used to outrun. Did I push too far? Did I misread them? Were they actually stronger than I thought? That internal dialogue is uncomfortable. Avoidants often rely on emotional suppression to feel safe. If something hurts, they minimize it. If something feels vulnerable, they detach from it. But loss has a way of bypassing suppression. When someone who felt secure and steady steps back, it exposes what was taken for granted. And that's when consideration begins. They start thinking about reaching out. Not in a dramatic movie scene way, not always with grand declarations. Sometimes it's subtle, a message that seems casual, a check-in disguised as curiosity, a reaction to something small, because admitting they miss you would require admitting they care deeply, and that level of vulnerability doesn't come easily. But the impulse to reconnect is there. And here's the truth. It's not always because they're healed. It's not always because they've suddenly transformed. It's often because your absence disrupted their emotional equilibrium. They feel the shift. They feel the loss of access. They feel that you're no longer orbiting around them. For the first time, they have to wonder if you're moving forward. And that uncertainty stirs something primal. Because when you stopped chasing, you didn't just withdraw attention, you broke the pattern. Most people respond to avoidant distance with heightened emotion. They argue, they plead, they analyze, they try to fix. You didn't. You responded strategically, calmly. You observed the dynamic and adjusted your participation. And when you did that, you stepped out of the predictable script. Avoidance feels safest in predictability, even dysfunctional predictability. They know how to navigate someone chasing them. They know how to handle emotional intensity directed at them. But they don't always know how to process someone who simply detaches with dignity. You didn't slam doors, you didn't burn bridges, you didn't attack their character. You just stopped volunteering for inconsistency. And that kind of boundary hits differently. Because now if they want access to you, it requires effort. It requires accountability. It requires stepping toward vulnerability instead of away from it. And that's the part that forces growth or exposes stagnation. They thought you were an option, someone who would always be there, someone who would tolerate emotional breadcrumbs, someone who would keep choosing them even when they weren't choosing you. But when you stopped choosing them blindly, the illusion shattered. You were never an option. You were a choice, a conscious one. And once you realized your value didn't depend on being tolerated, you became something they couldn't casually manage anymore. Now they see it more clearly. They see that your patience wasn't desperation. They see that your calmness wasn't weakness. They see that your love wasn't dependency. It was strength. It was maturity. It was emotional intelligence. And the hardest realization for them is this: you were offering something rare. In a world where people play games to protect their egos, you showed up authentically. In a culture that glamorizes detachment, you chose depth. In a dynamic where they leaned into control, you leaned into connection. And when you finally withdrew that connection, it wasn't chaos that followed. It was clarity. Clarity for you, that love should feel mutual. Clarity for them, that they miscalculated. They thought you were easy to play because you didn't compete for power. You weren't trying to win. You weren't trying to dominate the emotional field. You were trying to build something real. And when you realized they were more invested in maintaining distance than building closeness, you made the quietest, strongest decision possible. You stepped back. Not because you didn't care, but because you cared about yourself too. And that's the part that changes everything. Because when someone loves deeply but refuses to self-abandon, it forces everyone around them to rise or be left behind. Maybe they will reach out, maybe they won't. Maybe they will wrestle with their ego. Maybe they will convince themselves you weren't that important. Avoidants are skilled at reframing loss to protect themselves. But deep down, somewhere beneath the rationalizations, they know you were steady. They know you were safe. They know you were real. And even if pride keeps them silent, even if fear keeps them distant, there is something unforgettable about encountering someone who loved fully and walked away peacefully. You didn't try to prove your worth louder. You proved it by refusing to beg for recognition. That's the lesson they carry. That's the imprint you leave. Not as someone who is easy to manipulate, not as someone who is desperate for attention, but as someone who embodied love with boundaries. And here's the message for you, the one listening, the one who felt underestimated. Your strength was never in chasing someone who withdrew. Your strength was in recognizing when effort became one-sided. Your strength was in loving without losing yourself. Your strength was in choosing peace over potential. They thought you were easy to play, but what they met was someone who could love deeply and still walk away. Someone who could be warm and still have limits. Someone who could feel everything and still choose self-respect. And that kind of person isn't easy to play. They're impossible to forget.